Hello, I'm Jeanne Long, Executive Director of Chicago Collections Consortium, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, A Conversation with Gordon Segal. Chicago Collections Consortium is proud to partner tonight with Northwestern University, whose collection houses the unique historical records of Crate and Barrel and can be found in Northwestern's Charles Deering McCormick Library and Special Collection. The archival records generously given to Northwestern by Crate and Barrel founders Gordon and Carole Segal, Northwestern alumni, document the company from its inception in 1962 until 2015. The collections also contain materials of Crate and Barrel's sister brand, CB2, the children's store Land of Nod, and the Finnish design house, Mary Mecco. We'd like to acknowledge the Terra Foundation of American Art for their generous support of tonight's program, which is being presented as part of Art Design Chicago Now, an initiative funded by the Terra Foundation for American Art that amplifies the voices of Chicago's diverse creatives, past and present, and explores the essential role they play in shaping the now. Please check out the Terra's website for additional information on their programs and events. Additionally, I'd like to thank CCC donors whose generous support allows us to host unique free programming like this one being offered tonight. Their funding supports CCC's Cornerstone Initiative, Explore Chicago Collections portal, which provides free and open access to CCC archival member collections. I invite you to go online to check out CCC's website for other upcoming programs and sign up for our newsletter, which is located at the bottom of CCC's homepage. And for more information on Chicago Collections and Northwestern University Archives and Special Collections, please check out these websites. I'd like to introduce Kevin Leonard, Northwestern University Archivist and Chair of Chicago Collections Content Committee, who will be in conversation with Gordon Segal and will be joined by Brandon Radonski, who received his Bachelor of Science degree in Manufacturing and Design Engineering, a program based in Northwestern's Segal Design Center. Kevin?
Thank you, Jeanne, and thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Brandon. Gordon, I need to tell you something personally, that the first time I was responsible for purchasing a wedding gift, I went to Crate and Barrel in Plaza del Lago, had a wonderful experience, and if you were to go into my home now, I think you would recognize a lot of what's in the Leonard household. Yes, Northwestern University is very proud to hold corporate records, design materials, catalogs, photographs associated with Crate and Barrel. It's a wonderful collection that traces the history of a magnificent company. A company that's very important in presenting art and design, contemporary design in housewares and other products to the consumer market. Just tremendously proud to have that. So Gordon, thank you again for that. Thank you to Carole. So I hope, Gordon, we can address your ideas concerning outstanding, beautiful design and in consumer products and graphics and architecture. But before that, how about for the audience, we get to the origin story of the enterprise that you and your wife, Carole, created. Where did you two meet? What in your backgrounds led you to stunningly successful careers in retailing? How did you develop the idea and the experience that we know as Crate and Barrel?
Well, it started somewhat by chance. I think perhaps the tastes and styles that we liked were already there. Probably 2 years before we started, I had been in Copenhagen touring Europe with a friend, and I bought some ceramic teapots at a place called Den Permanente, basically a place in Copenhagen where they had the different respective artists of the day showing their work. I still look at them today and I said, I would have bought that for Crate and Barrel. It's amazing. They're still beautiful stoneware, the little teapots and a coffee pot. And so there was something there, but my mother always took my sister and I to the Art Institute, took us to, artistic events. So probably it was transferred early in that regard, but we started, it started for a strange reason. I graduated Northwestern, so did Carole, in 1960. We had met in our junior year and started dating. And then I'd gone off to New York to work in the restaurant industry after a tour of Europe. For sure, I wanted to be in cooking and serving and being in the restaurant field because I love the art of food preparation and food service and whatever. I went to work for the Four Seasons New York, which was a very eminent restaurant back in 1961. And I was, or 1960, I should say, but I wasn't paid very well, about $65 a week. And I basically, by the end of the year, I'd gone through all my savings and decided I was not going to be a great New York restaurateur. And I came back to Chicago, went into the real estate business, but also came back in January 61. And after a month or two, Carol and I got engaged. And we decided to have after we got married in June, and decided to have our honeymoon in the Caribbean, which if you went during the summertime when there were hurricanes was very inexpensive. So the part of it that's interesting is we went to 3 or 4 different islands, but we were in the Virgin Islands. We had our wedding, and we got a lot of wedding gifts from relatives and friends of our parents, but taste wasn't one of the things that they were, that many of them had, and consequently, we didn't like many of the wedding gifts. We were always looking at the great ads for Dansk Designs and Orfors and Costa Boda, and said we wanted beautiful Scandinavian design in our small apartment. Well, we were in this in the Virgin Islands, and near the harbor, there was a Danish shop. Virgin Islands used to be a province of Denmark. And we walked in, and there was a small Danish merchant. We were looking around the store, and my wife picks up this flatware and says, "How can this be Danish 18/8 flatware for $3.95 a place sitting? Dansk is $24.95. Then we picked up a teak board, and I said, "Look at this, Carol, it's beautiful." And again, it was like 1/4 the price of the market. And we're talking to this merchant who'd been there for years. We said, "How do you get these prices?" And he said, "Well, I go to Denmark direct, and I visit small factories, and I have them ship it directly to the store. Once in a while, they have salesmen coming around selling us, but I really import all the things directly from small resources in Scandinavia." Well, that stuck in the back of our mind. And then we had to go up to New York for some real estate business. And Carol's sister, who lived there, suggested a bunch of really interesting kitchenware and tabletop stores, which we visited and realized, boy, there was nothing this good in Chicago to select dinnerware, glassware, design was not, non-existent in Chicago. We had a wonderful furniture store called Baldwin Kingery. Harry Weiss's wife was part of that. But that was basically it. I mean, and they were not in the tabletop business to speak of, and whatever. So we came back home, not thinking of it. We went back, and we went back home, and I continued in real estate, and Carol was teaching school. We lived in Prairie Shores, one of the new developments at that time. And about 7, 8 months later, February of 62, one night I was washing the dishes we had bought in the Caribbean. And I said, "Carol, there got to be other young couples like ourselves with good taste and no money. I bet we can open a store." And she sort of poo-pooed it a little bit. "Oh, yeah, sure, Gordon. You're always talking about these real estate deals you're talking about." I said, "No, Carol, it'd be fun opening a store." So she agreed. And in the next 2 weeks, I went to visit the Danish and Swedish and Belgian trade commissioners, French trade commissioner. And in those days, they had catalogs of all their manufacturing companies in those countries, divided by categories. Obviously, we weren't looking for steel mills. We were looking for glass factories or China factories. And it so happened in Chicago that the trade counselor was a guy who headed the AMC buying office, which was the department store buying office in Copenhagen. And he pointed out to me in the book all the really small, very unusual, good Swedish glass factories. He said, "So write them, and they'll, ask them for a catalog and price list." So we went back, and I started a company called Euromarket Designs, which was, we didn't have the name Crate and Barrel in those days. So I created an import company, and we wrote, factories in Scandinavia, mostly in those days, Belgium, a little bit in France, and wrote them for catalogs and price lists. Now, Carol and I had never worked in retail. We didn't know a market from a markdown. We didn't know how to import anything. I mean, we were 2 kids that were 23 years old, 23 at that time. And, other than teaching school and doing a little real estate and a lot of restaurant work, really had no background. So we finally found a location down on Wells and Burton Street, an old elevator, dumbwaiter factory that they were going to move to a bigger site. and they were dismantling the place. And they said, well, you can have this by September 1st. And so we signed the lease. I remember it was, I don't know, $350 a month for the store. And we ended up waiting for it to be open. Meanwhile, we got notice of shipments, we placed orders. And we didn't, we figured we'd learn as we go about how to import product and everything. Those days you didn't have containers. People would ship you things in crates or barrels, basically these gigantic barrels or cartons. And it would be shipped on general cargo. And normally you shipped it mostly through New York or sometimes through Montreal. And the Chicago Seaway had just opened. And there were a few ships coming directly to Navy Pier from Europe. So that, believe it or not, at one time, that was a big wharf here in downtown Chicago. So the only problem was our landlords didn't move out on time. In fact, they didn't move out till, I think it was November 17th. And we knew Christmas was going to be very important. We had demurrage accumulating on shipments that were coming into the docks now. And we quickly had one guy who knew how to hit a hammer and knock wood on the wall. And we looked at the place. We couldn't afford to, all we had in capital was $17,000. Carol and I had saved about $10,000 from our wedding gifts and everything else. And my dad lent us all the cash he had, which was $7,000. And so we knew we'd set aside $10,000 for merchandise. So we only had $7,000 to redo the store, buy shelves, whatever. So we came up with the idea of just taking crating lumber and covering up the walls, because above about 7-8 feet, the walls were okay, but they were terribly damaged below. We couldn't afford to sheetrock, paint, and all that. So basically, we bought some big sanders. We hand sanded the greasy floors for 3 days and 3 nights. We literally were doing this for a very long time. We hammered up the crating lumber. We had one employee, and Carol and myself, we got one guy, Otto Postero, who was a kind of a working guy in the area who'd like to do a little bit remodeling, and he helped us. So there were 4 of us. And between the 4 of us, we hammered up the crating lumber, sanded the floors, cleaned the windows, hung some light fixtures. No spotlighting in those days, just a globe lamp that we found. And it was about maybe 10 days before we opened, and we had some crates and barrels sitting around. An acquaintance we knew was in the marketing business walked in just to see it. What are you guys doing? And well, how are you? And whatever. And Carol was upstairs helping us set up the store. And she said, well, what are you going to call the place? And Carol says, we're arguing all the time. We don't know what we're going to call it. China barn, pottery barn, not pottery barn, but every other name you could think of. And she said, well, she looked around. She said, why don't you call it Barrel and Crate? I was working downstairs, unpacking goods and working on paperwork, and Carol came down to the basement and she told me this lady had recommended Barrel and Crate. She said, but I think it'll sound better, Gordon, if we call it Crate and Barrel. I said, Carol, you're right. And so that's how the name came. Then we had to order a sign and get it up in 7, 8, or 10 days. So we just got hand painted, wooden board for a sign when we opened. There are pictures of the first store on Well Street. It was a 3-story building of which we occupied the first floor. And we opened on December 7th, the Christmas walk of 1962. And we were very excited. We finally got the store together. Carol was masterful at display. She laid burlap on top of the crates, and we put the glassware and the dinnerware and the candle holders. And so we had Danish wood and Scandinavian glass, some German glass, wonderful teak boards from Sweden, thin teak serving trays, laminated teak serving trays that were gigantic boom. They were very inexpensive. And we started, we had forgotten to buy a cash register that weekend. We didn't have a cash register, and we forgot to buy packaging supplies. So we're wrapping people's goods for the first week or so in newspaper. And, we had a little cigar box for our cash register. That's how the company started. And when we found out about 3 weeks later, when Christmas, we'd gotten through the Christmas season, we found out that we had marked a lot of the products at cost. So talking about being exceptional value, we not only bought well, we we didn't even mark half the goods up correctly because we didn't have some invoices we needed from some sources in the country that we needed to get. So, but at the end of the December, we had $8,000 worth of sales. And I said to Carol, I said, we had set up a little pro forma with our accountant. And he said, you know, if you do $100,000 of sales, you can pay yourself $100 a week to live, and that would work. And I said, Carol, we just did from September 7th to December 31st, we've done $8,000. I said, Carol, if we multiply this by 12, we'll make $96,000. Of course, I didn't know about Christmas. I'm Jewish. I never had a Christmas gift in my life. And all of a sudden, I thought that would go on forever. Well, January came and we did $4,000. February came and we did $2,000. And I was looking at losing all our money and my dad's money. And we were really kind of bleak. And we had a terrible winter in February of '63. It was just snow, 2 feet high. One day we had one customer made in a store. We had an $8 sale. I used to tell my staffs, about, selling and merchandising. We always said, remember, you'll never have as bad a day as we had this day in February of '63, where we had an $8 day. So, eventually March and April came and Old Town became popular because there was a couple fun restaurants. Chances are El Grifone, a little shop called the Town Shop opened up. There were a couple antiques dealers, Jeanne Segal and whatever. And Old Town sort of really started, attracting people, especially on weekends, not weekdays so much, but weekends. And we got better at display. We got better at knowing how to price merchandise. And we just started out with that one store. And at the end of the year, we did do about $90,000 or $95,000. And then the second year we did double that. And the next year we did 50% more again. So, and then the landlord said, well, my girlfriend, you're just making success because Wells Street's become popular. And my girlfriend and I only had a 3-year lease. He said, we want to open a store here. So we'll look for another place. But I knew they had a piece of 50-foot vacant piece of land just to the south. And during college, I'd worked for lawyers where we cleaned up bad properties that were left over from the Depression that were blighted or had, only partial ownership, or we couldn't even find ownership. And this lot was under foreclosure, I found out. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll clean up this real estate deal for you. And you won't have to lose this property. You have a quick claim interest, and I'll find other relatives and we'll owners of the property, and we'll make good on the property. And so we can maybe build a store next door. I'll give you your money will pay off the foreclosure costs, and we'll make good on the title. But my deal is that you'll put down the land as security, and I'll build a building on it, and the bank will lend me the money for the building. So that's how we built our own building in end of '65, early '66. We opened up the first building that we ever built, and a terrific architects. And that's when we did the wood ceilings and the wood beams and, real proper wood floors. And so that was when we really took off.
But you touched upon, and Kevin and I have talked about this, not just the great products, but the great displays, which were really changing, the way, the customer shopping experience was, that it was interesting and fun and inviting that way in terms of the displays. That was very, very exciting to see at the time. So that's another huge component of the contributions, Crate and Barrel has made to, for the shopper too.
Yeah. Well, we were very much lucky. We found a young designer named Lon Hapkirk who worked in those first number of years, followed by another designer named Mark Shamandel. Then Raymond Aronson followed him. We had 2 or 3 visual display people who also sold. Everybody sold in those days. But Carole sort of taught them what we were doing and what we wanted to do. And the idea was we wanted the product to be accessible. We wanted the product to be touchable. We weren't going to put a pristine 4 glasses on a shelf and that was it. We wanted a mass, 24, 36, 48 glasses on a shelf. So we created these tiers of glass shelving or tiers of pedestals. And they came up, these young gentlemen who probably were in our design leadership for 20 years, really came up that one succeeded the other, but each one lent something to stacking and massing and lighting. We learned how to use great spotlighting. And then, of course, we got into the Marimekko business and used Marimekko textiles to backdrop the merchandise and loop it in the ceilings and drop it behind displays. So between spotlighting and fabric and massing and very good signage, we really wanted not every product priced, which we did, of course, but we wanted a sign describing whether the item was porcelain from Portugal or whether it was glass from Finland or whether it was a beautiful red pottery from Valerie down in France. So in a sense, we tried and to educate. And our point was, obviously we're a family. Most of the people who started joining us were school teachers who were bored with teaching. And basically I said, that's great, because we really had to be in the education business. We had to educate our staff, we had to educate our customer, and we had to, you know, make sure our people could explain and understand, and our signage, when obviously you can't have a salesperson for every customer, but our signage had to tell a story. They had to tell the background, what the product was, where it came from, if we could. And, you know, and then of course that helped us train our associates. And then we created over a number of years, we grew very slowly. We kept that one store from 65 to 68. We eventually kept it till 75, actually, that store. But in the 68, we opened Plaza del Lago, our second store in Wilmette, up between Kenilworth and Wilmette. And that was our second store. And we didn't open our third store till 71 in Oak Brook. So we very slowly grew the company. We had a very successful first few years, but we thought, look, we were very into knowing what we knew, and we really didn't know how to multiply stores or buy from multiple stores or distribute to multiple stores. And we had to learn it all by sort of learning it a little at a time, doing it ourselves. I mean, we didn't have trucks to deliver to our stores. We had one place where the goods came into. We had to pack it up. I put it in the back of my station wagon, drove it to another store. And it wasn't until we opened Plaza del Lago, which was 68, that we got, you know, after it had been open about a year, we found a small warehouse and office area in Wilmette, downtown Wilmette. And we were able to put the inventory in a central place and feed it to the 2 or 3 stores that we had. But it was a very, learn as you go. I mean, by that time, we were in our mid-20s or moving into our mid to late 20s. And we were, you know, very naive about being retailers. And we were doing it all ourselves. And we really, you know, were very hands-on, maybe too hands-on in retrospect, but we very much loved what we were doing and probably wouldn't have opened the second store in Plaza del Lago except after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. We said, you know, this is in the rioting right down on Division Street. There wasn't, you know, we weren't 2 miles from burning stores. We thought maybe it was a good idea to diversify. That's when we opened Plaza del Lago and Oak Brook. We figured, you know, the city was, you know, a very scary place at that time. So those are the early days.
Well, thank you for sharing that. So you you made a necessity out of the modest beginnings, or you made it a virtue out of the modest beginnings, excuse me. You learned as you went, but you also mentioned your early work in New York, Four Seasons. You mentioned Prairie Shores, and to me, it's like, all right, so there's something about modern design
right,
that sticks with you from a young age. Your family was in the restaurant business, if I recall correctly. Crate and Barrel built in its early years an outstanding reputation for customer service.
Right.
Did you pick that up as well from your background, family background?
Absolutely. My dad had a small family restaurant. My sister, I have an older sister, and we both learned on busy holidays or busy weekends or whatever that we had to work there. And we learned to be a busboy. We learned to be a waiter. We learned to be a host or hostess. I washed dishes. I worked the salad bar. I worked the steam table. I mean, it was a small restaurant, and everybody did everything. But you learned how important customer service was and how much fun it was. Someone coming in for a dinner or meal or lunch, and they come in a little hungry and a little tired, and you could turn them from a sort of a grumpy personality into a very happy personality. And I love that. And so that sort of reception, we sort of started building into our staff. And we talked about educating our customer. Well, after we educated the sales associates, educating our customer was a very important thing, because even though our prices were terrific for what they were, if they didn't understand this was hand-blown glass, if they didn't understand this was hand-thrown pottery, if they didn't understand that this was beautiful enamelware from Belgium or Norway or whatever, the prices were still higher than the local housewares that you could buy in the hardware store, or Carson's or Marshall Fields. This was product that people hadn't seen before. And we weren't buying from wholesalers, we were buying from unknown factories in Europe. It might be a small potter in Valerie, it might be a wonderful glass factory we had for years called Hofmantorp in southern Sweden, made very contemporary, beautiful glass. So all of this was an education that the reason our prices were so good is, and here's the underlying fundamental thing we did here, and this was probably why it was unique. Most small stores that open up in the china and glass or gift business in those days, they would go to New York or Atlantic City or Los Angeles or San Francisco for gift shows, and they'd see these importers. Now, the importer would buy a glass for, $1, let's call it, and land it with duties and shipping for $1.50. And he'd turn around and sell it to the retailer for $3, and the retailer would sell it to the consumer for $6. And we said, no, we're going to not buy it from importers. We're going to go directly to factories in Europe. We're going to import it. We'll only mark it up once so the consumer can buy it. Maybe our costs are a little higher, so we couldn't sell it for $3, but maybe $3.25, $3.50. So we could sell our product for 30 to 45% less than equivalent product that other small stores or department stores were selling it for. And we worked on very tight margins, knowing that our price value had to be very good, and that was very important to us. So it did not only have to be wonderful product, it had to have authenticity, quality that held up when people used it and would enjoy using it. It had to have value, because we were catering to other young people like ourselves, and we had no money. So that's the customer we wanted. It so happened we attracted some wealthy people from the Gold Coast in the second or third year we were in business, and our reputation began to spread. But it was always an orientation about how do we find really great design at great prices, whether it's plastics or ceramics or glassware or flatware. And the issue was, we've got to go to Europe. We've got to, mostly in those days, it was all Europe. It was Asia didn't come till 30 years later. And we were at a point in time when Europe after World War II, from 45 to say late 50s, early 60, they were just getting back their basic elemental things after the destruction of World War II. But in the late 50s and the 60s, all of a sudden there was more wealth accumulated in Europe, and people wanted nicer things. And so there was a bonanza of Scandinavian design in the late 50s, 60s, a wonderful group of designers in Italy, wonderful French dinnerwares were coming out. Even the English were doing beautiful contemporary things for a while there, and Terence Conran and the design teams, and Frank Thrower from Dartington Glass. All of a sudden, they were making really nice product for the consumers in Europe, because all of a sudden they had the wealth and they had a decision. They wanted nicer homes. And so our timing was incredible in terms, and we didn't know it at the time, but looking back, we were just there when all the great modern design was coming out of Europe. And so we were traveling there. And a funny thing about it is there were no glass factories in America. We had very few ceramic factories. I mean, there was Lenox and the traditional factories here, of course, that made beautiful porcelain, but not the contemporary stoneware, the beautiful pottery that we wanted to be selling in crate and barrel. And so, we had a field day of, being able to find great small manufacturers. We can negotiate great prices. We were also very good at negotiation, and eventually when we had buyers, we taught them about negotiations and how to become friends with the vendor, but be very strict on the prices. And I remember telling them, look, guys, you're not working for Gordon, you're working for the consumer. You're the consumer's buying agent. And so you become friendly with the factory. Don't become so friendly that you're doing him a favor and becoming a sales agent. You're the consumer's buying agent, and you got to go there and buy a product at a price where the consumer is going to be excited, not just by the design, not just by the quality, but by the value. Those were the underlying elements of how we started the company. And it went on for, that was the underlying thing for years, for 30, 40 years. And the store became more and more successful. One of our early part-time salespeople was a lady named Barbara Turf. She was a school teacher. And I convinced her after about 1 year as a part-timer, I said, look, you're not working during the summer, you're off, schools are closed. Why don't you come work in our new Plaza del Lago store, which she did. By August, I said, why are you going back to the store? You're such a terrific, salesperson and personality. It'd be wonderful. Why don't you, work full-time? And we just opened the store, and I said, I need an assistant manager, so why don't you take over? Well, she eventually became a store manager. She eventually came to our offices and became a head of HR. Then she became, the buyer head, and then she became the head of merchandise. And eventually, many years later, she succeeded me. She was a great personality, and vendors loved her. She knew every vendor in Europe and Asia personally, and people would just adore working with her. Her staff loved working with her. So she was very creative, and she and I traveled for the first 10, 15 years. And as she learned different categories, I would turn them over to her for buying. And then, after a while, I only kept glass as my last buying thing. I love glassware, and I love buying glassware. So I kept that to the last moment of delegating that buying to someone else. But we developed terrific people who all believed in the philosophy. We had tremendous buy-in from our people in our headquarters and tremendous buy-in from our stores. And then my job was to go out to the stores and make people as neurotic as we were about visual display, about treating customers right, about making sure the stores were beautiful, that the sidewalk was swept, that the windows had no schmutz on them, that the stores were pristine and a sign wasn't crooked, and that the stores had some life and feeling like people cared about them. And you often seen chain stores that in our business that didn't do that. They over merchandised, they had poor visual display, they had poor signage, they had staff that didn't know the product, or if they did know the product, weren't that interested. So we had this great advantage of enthusiastic staff, and they learned to stack the glasses. They learned to make sure the lights were on the display and not on the floor. They made sure that, that the inventory was ordered properly from our warehouse. And we trained the best group of store managers in the housewares business in America. And our stores were bigger than our competitors. Our houseware stores were 8, 9, 10,000 feet. And as we grew first to Boston, then to Dallas, then to the New York and New Jersey area, then to Washington, D.C., then to California, San Francisco, and L.A. And of course, at the end of the day, we were in most of the major cities in America. And as we went, we just kept learning about how to market nationally, how to grow nationally. At the same time that Barbara Turf was a part-time associate, there was a young guy who lived in the neighborhood named Tom Shortledge, who became our marketing. I was trying to find someone to redo our packaging. We had original packaging, which was brown and had stencil letters on it. And I kept interviewing notable design people in town on graphic design, and everything that came back to me was not Crate and Barrel. And Tom, who'd worked for us about 6 months at that time, he was assistant art director. He was from Kansas City. He was working at Young and Rubicam. And I said, Tom, I'm having such trouble coming up with a logo and a packaging design that would work. He said, why don't you give me a shot at it? I said, sure, Tom, try anything. You know what we're like. You know who we should be. So he's the guy who came up with this modified Helvetica typeface and Crate and Barrel wrapped around bags and boxes. And then I said, Tom, it's terrific. Why don't you help me work on our catalog, our first catalogs? And then I said, Tom, why don't we start doing some advertising? So he was very good, not only at graphics, he was very good at copy. He had a great sense of humor. And so, he could write, he did these line drawings. We ran these little ads in Chicago Magazine or, different, not serious medium, but what we could afford. And he did these funny line drawings, and then he'd tell the story about the product we were selling and the difference between a 5-inch knife and a 9-inch knife. You know, why the difference of these knives and what are they meant for and what to use them for in culinary preparation. So I was the most fortunate guy to meet Barbara Turf, to meet Tom Shortledge, all in this early period. In the early mid 60s, 67, 60, no, it must have been 67, 68. And all of a sudden we pulled together the graphic stuff, started to do the marketing, and started pulling together our first catalogs. And that's how it sort of came together, was just by, just by passion and inspiration and being involved and being hands-on and loving what we were doing. And you asked Kevin, where did it all come from? And I said, I can't really tell you where. I know where it came from, but as we got into it and went on buying trips and met vendors that we loved, that would go to their houses and we'd hear how they talked about design, and they, oh, Gordon, I was in Denmark when Torben Oskov says, Gordon, we were talking about, he had Mary Mecco in this store for him in Farva and the Stroget in Copenhagen. He said, Gordon, you should go up to Helsinki and meet Armi Ratia, the head of Mary Mecco, and talk about buying fabric from her. And he introduces me to their head of marketing and whatever. And so Carole and I change our itinerary, hop on a plane and fly up to Finland after we'd been in Sweden and met the team up there and learned how to buy the product and bring the product in and, how to display it. And they sent, when we first opened, they sent a person over to work with us, and it was terrific. And, we just developed marvelous relationships. But as we did this and we visited these friends in Europe and especially in Scandinavia, we went to their homes, we had dinner with them, we heard their philosophy. We'd spend a weekend in Birkos, Army summer, country house. And we developed an understanding of how important design and quality and style is in their lifestyle. And so that became what became our lifestyle. I learned from these people. We'd walk along stores. I'd walk along a store. I remember one rainy, cold March, I was in Paris with two of my buyers, and we were walking around down the Rue de Seine on the left bank. And all of a sudden we came to a very small storefront. Maybe it was 20 feet, 15, 20 feet wide, all glass windows. And I looked in. I said, guys, stop a minute. Gordon, it's rainy, it's cold, we can't stop. I said, girls, stop a minute. Take a look at the store. Well, the store was based on color. It was springtime, early springtime, and everything, all they had was spring green. They were selling clothing. They were selling home furnishings. They were selling bicycles. They were selling, raincoats. Everything was spring green. So it was a store whose theme wasn't the product. Its theme was, we sell a color. And I'm sure in the summer was yellow, and the fall was, a fall color, and the winter was winter color. I just remember saying to our people, I said, guys, look how people think here. They think about how beautiful they can make something, how unique they could be. They want to be unique and different, because there's plenty of stores in Paris. But if we ever seen anything like this, and we all stood there for maybe 20 minutes, we didn't have iPhones in those days to take pictures or anything. And it was already, I think, past closing time, so we couldn't walk in. But just seeing this incredible merchant who had thought, I'm going to open a store selling color, not tabletop and not apparel. I'm going to sell color. So when you think about how creative and flexible you could be, when you travel to Europe, and you still travel to Europe and see wonderful stores in the major cities, and these people have a sense of artistry, a sense of quality, a sense of beauty that they want to be selling. And that became what we did at Crate and Barrel, but it was all over many, many years, just absorbing it year after year, getting better at what we did. We grew very slowly, maybe one store a year. After 10 years, maybe we opened 2 stores. But people would say, why don't you open a lot more stores? And I'd say, well, because I want to control it. I want to make it beautiful. I want to make it right. I'm not interested in how much money I can make. Sure, I wanted to make sure we were financially solvent. But my goal was to sell beautiful tabletop and home furnishing designs, not to build a big chain of stores. So we grew very slowly over many years. It wasn't until the 90s that we started expanding more, because the organization was set up to do it. We had made enough people neurotic enough to do it. And, you know, I remember when we went to New York, that was, trying to remember, 1995. And I wanted to make sure that when we opened up on Madison and 59th Street, we were able to, after 3 years of negotiations, I got a really big prime space. But when I opened, I sent 75 people there for a year who were, you know, I knew were already Crate and Barrel, you know, mentally absorbed people who can make that store feel like a Crate and Barrel in New York, where people, sort of salespeople, could not care a bit. And I wanted people who cared and maintained the store. And so that's what we did, and it worked. It was crazy financially, but it really was worth doing. So,
Brandon, you are a young, formally trained designer. What's your take on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible and honestly an honor to be here with you today, Mr. Segal. And just wanted to say thank you to the Chicago Collections Consortium and you, Kevin, for having me here. My very first product design class, I took it here at Northwestern at the Segal Design Institute. We looked at multiple case studies of your work and how you prioritize the user experience and the consumer experience. And one thing that's so astounding about your work and Crate and Barrel as a company is the cohesion and just an identity between the typeface and the architecture and the products that you offer. And I was just curious, is that something you planned from the start, or was it more serendipitous or out of iteration?
it came internally. We just grew more and more interested in architecture and visual display. And we kept trying and experimenting with things. A lot of things didn't work. Then more things did work. It was a lot, just like if you're an architect, you do a lot of different sketches of an idea. Well, we actually built, you know, different ideas for visual display. We kept, you know, working with good architects and kept pushing them to do things in a more warm but dramatically contemporary fashion. So the idea up to that time, contemporary stores in New York or Chicago, LA became very modern, with modern materials, cold materials, selling modern furniture, which was often cold and linear and dramatic. And we said, no, we want to have a warm environment, but a clean environment, a contemporary environment. But we could use wood, we can use white sheetrock, but let's build our stores so, in a sense, they don't offend a person who isn't strictly contemporary, modern thinking, but who is a broad-based consumer who could come in and feel comfortable in the store. And so that sort of evolved. And the same thing with, you know, the way we did fixturing. We just kept pushing the envelope from store to store. And eventually we hired a Belgian architect who was working here with one of the firms, and we named Jacques Verlinden, and we hired him to come on board. And he started evolving the stores and the architecture. And this was after New York, 96 or 97, he came on board. And then for the next 15, 20 years, he died early of a brain disease, but he was very influential in the way our stores evolved architecturally. And he was very talented. And he built the North Avenue store. He built many of our stores and that opened for 10 or 15 years. But he worked with Ray Aronson, who was one of our first store designers, who became head of store display and design, who became eventually a key player and probably the number 2 or 3 guy after I retired. And he had a great influence on choosing the right people to be the store display people, you know, choosing and evolving the fixturing, constantly working with new lighting and new ideas for that. But we just had luckily we took our time and hired people with a passion for what we were doing. And if they didn't have a passion, we'd say to them, look, you know, either you feel it or you don't. And if you don't, you know, tell us before we tell you, because, you know, we want people who really care about the customer and the product and the display and service. And, you know, you don't always get that. But we were able to attract wonderful people. And it was, you know, it was a place young people didn't, young women especially, it was mostly a female, I'd say, staff. Not because we were bigoted against male staff members, but there weren't many who wanted to be in this business. And women were much more interested in tabletop and cooking and kitchen in those days than men were. And so we attracted a staff that was very interested in creating the emotional environment so that we really cared about our stores and the way it happened. But it was all evolution. There was no moment when all of it was created suddenly. You went from A, and then you got an A plus, and then you got an A plus plus, and then you went to double A. I mean, it was like we just got better at what we were doing. And we made all the mistakes you can possibly make, but we kept learning from them and evolving. So there was no immediate genius here. It was 30, 40 years of evolution. But the philosophy never changed.
And clearly the commitment to the customer never changed, you know, and understanding who you were trying to appeal and serve, frankly. So that's still recognized.
Yeah, I retired now in 2008. Barbara Turf, who was the president and head merchant, she took over as CEO in 2008 and ran it to 2012. We had to retire at the age of 70, way too young, but that was our deal with our partners who had come in and helped finance the growth and what we were doing. And they didn't have good merchants succeed us for 2 or 3 short cycles. And then they found recently, a year and a half ago, a really wonderful lady who's a real experienced merchant. So the company has been doing terrific. It's grown. It's 3 times the size in volume of when I ran the company, and there weren't many more stores. It's just that the industry has evolved, the company has evolved. Our internet business is today half to 55% of all of our sales. Our partners urged us to get into the internet business, which I said, what's the internet? This was in 2000. And thank goodness I had partners who, you know, let me know it would be a good idea to get in the internet and learn about it. And so the business is evolving. All retail is evolving. And thank goodness that the company has, you know, kept pace with the vast change that's going on. And now we look back and we say, you know, we're almost 60 years old, you know, well, at the end of this year, we'll be 60. So, you know, but it didn't start out with some great concept. It started out with 2 very young, sort of naive husband and wife. And Carole had tremendous talent in terms of visual display, and she was great at, you know, serving customers and explaining to them what the store was about. And so the evolution couldn't have happened. It couldn't have developed without Carole. So she was full-time until, you know, Chris was born in our old first son was born in 65. And then she'd work part-time, and then we opened Plaza in 68, and she came back full-time for 6 months, then went part-time again. And then we had our second child, and eventually our third child. Then she went on, after, you know, a number of years of raising our kids, she went on to start another company in Chicago called Foodstuffs, which is, you know, gourmet food store that opened in Glencoe, and now is in 5 or 6 North Shore kind of businesses. She did that for about a decade, and then has been working in philanthropy ever since. So we had this interest in making customers happy and delivering a product that was unique and interesting. And we were interested in motivating young people to do great things. You know, we gave them the freedom to create. We didn't have a structure which says, no, you can't do that. There was no rule book. It was sort of like, how do you see it? How do you want to display it? Come up with some new ideas. But once we came up with something we thought was good, we reproduced it, you know, in all the stores. So it was constantly evolving as a company. If you saw pictures of the first crate and barrel, you'd see a lot of crates, you know, maybe they were 3 feet high, 3.5 feet high. And on top of them was burlap. And on top of them was some ceramics and cookware. I remember we had a Belgian cast iron factory called Oudenaarde that made an enamel cast iron. There was half the price of the Dutch Druware, which was a famous Dutch enamelware, cookware. And, you know, this was as good a look, but it was, you know, it was a different company. We had to explain to people why enameled cast iron was such a wonderful cooking vessel. People now are getting back to cooking with cast iron, but in those days it was really, you know, unique. People think cast iron, who wants to lift those heavy pans? I can buy this cheap aluminum and it's much easier to cook with. Well, all that was education because cast iron cooks better, and certainly for making certain kinds of meals. So that love of cooking, that love of serving, that love of working with customers, I guess that answer your question, Kevin, came from my early upbringing and my emotional, sense of what makes me happy is making customers happy. And, at the end of the day, how do you know their happiness? It's how the cash register rings. So if the cash register keeps ringing, you're making them happy. If the cash register wasn't ringing, they weren't so happy. So you sort of learn by the results.
Gordon, thank you for sharing so much information about your life, about Carole's life, about Crate and Barrel. Appreciate your time today, and certainly appreciate the store that you created that has been so successful and so dramatic. Before we let you go, though, Brandon, Jeanne, anything you want to ask of Gordon?
I had one more question. You talked a lot about how your conversations with the vendors in Europe and the various designers that you worked with were really inspirational and formative for you. Is there anything, today, any media or designers that are inspiring you?
Actually, there's some French designers and some Italian designers that I read, some European media that I like to look at and I like to see from a distance. I've not met them, I've not sat in their furniture. One of the things you got to be careful about with furniture, at the end of the day, you can have something that's remarkably unique in design. But at the end of the day, and by the way, this was again a thing I didn't mention, the product not only had to be beautiful, it had to be saleable. So you can see these beautiful products that were very uncomfortable when you sat in them. So if you see a product, you always got to test it. It's like you don't buy a car without sitting in it and understanding it. Well, people would, not understand that. So I got to my buyers, listen, when you go there and you look at something and it's wonderful, make sure you sit in it and make sure it works and make sure it feels it's easy to get out of, it's easy to sit in. You could sit in for a long while reading a book. Make sure that's the practical aspect of selling a product they're going to want to keep in their home for a long time. You're not in the business of selling a product and saying, goodbye, who cares? I got your money. It doesn't matter. No, it does matter because that customer will come back if you have the right product and you've sold it to them with the right understanding. So no, I haven't been over to Europe and probably meeting with these designers for 3 years now, probably. We didn't travel that way in the year before COVID. And of course, we haven't traveled the last several years. So I guess it's, do I follow anything? If you read, one of the media I read every day is the London Financial Times. And on weekends, they have very special sections about home furnishings and design. Very English orientated, but often they pick up Italian and Scandinavian, the new Scandinavian designers. But not having been to, there in 3 or 4 years, my wife and I hope to get to Denmark at the end of this year, beginning of next year, to visit friends and travel up to Finland. And, if it's in the middle of winter, we'll probably wait till the spring, summer, but we want to go see things that have evolved now.
Gordon, let me ask a question. Earlier on, I mentioned to you that while my home doesn't have the sleek, contemporary, clean Crate and Barrel look, there's a lot of Crate and Barrel in there.
Right.
What's in your house?
Well, we have a mix. We have sofas and upholstery from Crate and Barrel, but we have some beautiful classic Danish design, like some of the wing chairs and some of the beautiful wood designs that were done in the 60s. We also have some antiques that were done from Scandinavia that were done, years ago in the 30s that were, when you think back, they were very contemporary for those days. And we have some, stuff from Hoffman, who was done at the turn of the century from Austria, who did some interesting, furniture pieces that were remarkably contemporary, but of course they have this traditional look of that period in Austrian design. So it's really a mix. It's not a real modern contemporary home. The home itself is a traditional enlarged Cape Cod sort of design. We got it years ago, and we kept involving what we did with it. But we love to collect beautiful things that have beautiful quality designs that go with it. So we love George Jensen's designs from the early 1900s through the 1950s and 60s, when they were doing beautiful tabletop and servingware and things of that nature, because the artistry and things of that nature are wonderful. So those are, to us, beautiful things. Don't necessarily have to be very modern or contemporary. They just got to be handcrafted and beautiful and thoughtful in the way they're made.
Thank you.
And beautiful things for that point can easily mesh with other items, having that relationship too.
Right.
But I was really appreciative, Gordon, of, sharing from the Chicago perspective too, in our conversation tonight, how, the role the city played in terms of the placement of the stores, the reaction of the customers, the weather, the impact. But that was really fun to learn about, and having the opportunity to visit Northwestern and dive into the archives and learn even more about the company. But this was luxurious tonight to hear it from you. So thank you. And thank you to Brandon, and obviously to Kevin too. So this is great.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Happy to do this.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing this, Gordon, and best to you and Carol, and thank the two of you for your wonderful appreciation of outstanding design.
Thank you. Thank you for the interview.